Where was Atlantis?
I can't tell you.
You can't or won't?
I can't tell you because I am an archaeologist, and apparently my job is to hide the truth about Atlantis.
It sounds like you are gatekeeping the location from me.
This is why I spent most of my adult life training to be an archaeologist, so that I could hide the truth from people like you.
Like me.
Because I want it for myself.
Like podcasters?
Yeah.
Is that it? Okay.
Yeah. When you're all suffering down here, I will be in Atlantis with the other archaeologists, living it up.
Welcome to Doomscroll. I'm your host, Joshua Citarella. My guest is David Wengrow, an archaeologist and professor at University College London.
I mean, the idea that the pyramids of Egypt were not constructed by ordinary African people comes straight out of the roots, the foundations of Egyptology and archaeology. You know,
this is an important story if you would maybe share for people who haven't heard that before.
Yeah, so in the late 19th and early 20th century, the leading archaeologist in the world was this guy, William Matthew Flinders Petrie, who worked a lot in Egypt and Palestine, and is credited, if you study archaeology, you learn about Petrie as the kind of father of archaeological science. He made a huge number of innovations which became central to the way that the discipline functioned. He was also a eugenicist who firmly believed that the working classes needed to be either controlled or turned into a sort of hereditary underclass, and that intelligence and IQ were the preserve of certain select races. And in his work on ancient Egypt, there is an enormous kind of paradox at the heart of it. Because on the one hand, he actually produced a lot of the evidence and did a lot of the field work that actually made visible for the first time the cultural roots of ancient Egyptian civilization. You know, what existed before the pharaohs, before the pyramids and all that. Petrie was one of the main contributors to that. But in the process of actually producing all that knowledge, he also did something else, which was to place an absolute division between the origins of Egyptian civilization and the continent of Africa. He explicitly denied that Africans could have achieved or produced literacy, monumental architecture, urbanization, all those other things that happened in that part of the world. And he attributed them to what he called initially the new race. He just called it the new race.
Who is the new race?
Who is the new race? He wrote numerous articles trying to get to the bottom of his self-created question, which ultimately came down to craniometry and measuring skulls collected from ancient graves. And he came to the conclusion initially that the new race was definitely not African, but had migrated from somewhere in Western Asia, possibly with links up towards the Caucasus. You see, we're getting closer and closer to white people.
I see.
And then there's a category, and then there's a category which was called Hamite or Hamitic civilization, which was also believed to be more kind of Eurasian than African. And, you know, these may sound like very obscure ideas, but actually the classifications that were created at that time fed in to the modern conflicts, ethnic conflicts in countries like Rwanda, right up until the modern era. So that actually is at the root of our own discipline. And by creating that initial division, it opened that chink, that kind of window, into which you can insert whatever you like. You know, the basic premise is that it couldn't possibly have been Africans.
Right.
And then you can talk about whatever you like. You can talk about the master race. You can talk about aliens from Venus, you know, whatever you like. But actually, and this is what I mean when I say you're never going to refute this stuff by, correcting their facts.
No.
It's a mythical structure, the intention of which is essentially to keep saying and keep saying and keep saying it wasn't Africans.
Right. This migration of people, this new race, are these who we sometimes refer to as the Indo-europeans?
Well, Indo-European is a perfectly legitimate concept in historical linguistics. It goes back to William Jones, who pointed out the resemblances, the connections among a whole series of languages from Iran to Ireland, which are real. They're real linguistic connections. But there's another history to Indo-European studies which goes way beyond language, and which posited links between language, culture, and biological race.
Right.
Which generally in the early 20th century meant trying to reconstruct and search for an Indo-European homeland, a place where language, culture, and race formed a kind of perfect unity.
Yeah.
And from which this population spread.
Is there a specific name for that population?
Well, this is where things get a bit murky, because if you ask a historical linguist, they'll explain about what they call proto-languages, of which you have many examples, and these are basically reconstructions from surviving languages or language that is preserved in ancient texts. You have to imagine something like a family tree, or just a tree, like a phylogeny, where you try to establish the links and the connections among different languages, and you trace them back to a kind of the core kind of common elements. And this is what they refer to as a proto-language.
Yeah.
Now, if you ask a bona fide historical linguist, they'll explain to you that a proto-language is not a spoken language. It's not that there are people walking around using these terms. I think there was someone once who tried to write a poem in Proto-Indo-European as a kind of joke.
Okay.
But these are constructions, right? We don't have anything like the full range of languages that actually existed. We have a small kind of a tiny part of the spectrum of what was actually spoken, from which it's possible to reconstruct a kind of proto form. But it's construction. It's a historical construction. It's not a population. It's not a group of people. And it's well documented that in the early 20th century, in the mid-20th century, this whole field of research was basically hijacked by the Nazis and linked to the search for an Aryan homeland. And there are whole books and studies about this. And obviously after the Second World War, nobody wanted to talk about this very much. But in fact, through the genuine scientific innovations that have been made, particularly in the field of genetics and ancient DNA, suddenly this whole language is back again. And it's very prominent in my field. There was even a paper published recently, just last year, in a top science journal called The Genetic Origins of the Proto-Indo-Europeans.
Oh boy.
So we're back to a discourse which says that culture, and we're talking here about things that happened 5,000 years ago in a part of the world north of the Black Sea, for which there's no written evidence at the time. So we're talking about archaeological finds, burials, artifacts, that kind of thing. And what's being reintroduced, and I would say normalized again, is the idea that culture, language, and biology form a kind of unity. The idea that one can sort of escape from the complexity and the mixture of human cultures and get back to some kind of pure essence. And remarkably, the kind of entities which are identified in this way, these sort of proto-groups or proto-populations, map very faithfully onto the racial categories that were invented in the early 20th century.
Yeah.
And you get very similar looking maps of migrations, human populations, moving often in rather bizarre ways that sort of ignore the topography, sort of like striding across seas and rivers and mountains, spreading outwards from some kind of original sort of Urheimat or homeland.
Is there though some historical record of a real migration that has to do with people out of the, let's say, like the north of India into the Middle East that would be described as this like Aryan origin of civilization?
This is an explosive topic in India.
Or is it just a linguistic link rather than a, distinct ethnic group?
Well, first of all, it makes the assumption that language is transmitted by people moving around in population groups. Actually, there are a myriad other ways that languages are transmitted. And, what it's supposed to conjure up in the imagination is this idea of a sort of tribal society in which everybody speaks the same language, buries their dead in the same way, builds houses the same way, rides horses, whatever it may be. And, this is a very obvious projection of the modern idea of a nation and of the nation state. I mean, all nation states have these kind of myths, the Dutch are supposed to go back to the ancient Batavians, the Germans come from the Proto-Germanic groups, and so on and so forth. The French from the Gauls. This is part and parcel of the romance and the mythology of modern nations, projected back onto a mythical past. And all European nations have some kind of version of this. But these are very recent ideas. If you actually look at the way that language, for example, is transmitted in so-called tribal societies, including many of the ones we've been talking about, Aboriginal Australia, people are multilingual. I mean, they may speak 4 or 5 different languages. I'm not just talking about variations of vocabulary or syntax or something, actually different languages. And there are many other ways, kinship systems, that language is transmitted other than a group of people literally upping sticks and, walking around the landscape. The basic approach is always to try and retreat from the complexity of the present back to some kind of root, some kind of cultural, biological, linguistic purity. Now, this really bears, this is arbitrary. This is a choice one makes about how to study these things. Ultimately, you come back to the fact that humans evolved on the continent of Africa. And you could look completely differently at the whole thing. You could emphasize or research the connections, degrees of connectedness among things. The idea that everything forms a kind of tree-like formation that gets you back to some pure original source is a model. It's an image. It's not, there's nothing sort of essential about it.
To watch part 2 of this episode, you can support the show on Patreon.
I have noticed in the course of trying to research these things that there is still a remarkable resistance to the idea that this thing that we call the European enlightenment owed an intellectual debt to anything that wasn't homegrown on Western European soil. Which, if you think about it, is a very counterintuitive thing. I mean, this is all happening after the so-called Age of Discovery, which of course was only an age of discovery for Western Europeans. I mean, they weren't discovering anything, people lived there. But it's a period which the French historian Paul Hazard in the 1930s, I think, wrote a book. In English, it's called The Crisis of the European Mind. And I like this book a lot because it does something, it goes against the grain of what we're usually told about the European Enlightenment, which is that it was a manifestation of confidence, of Europe's growing economic power, growing military might, not just in the Americas, but in the Indian Ocean. And that the kind of mental habits that developed at the time, particularly the habit of feeling one could confidently classify all the world's cultures and societies and arrange them into a sort of hierarchy, at which European civilization was always at the top, that this was a manifestation of cultural superiority, of cultural confidence. But actually what Hazard argues, and I think shows quite compellingly, well, it's in the title of his book, this was also a kind of mental crisis for countries, European nations, which had only known monarchy and which had only known church dogma and top-down forms of authority, are suddenly exposed to a kaleidoscope of other ways of living.
With the encounter with the New World.
Not just, also in Africa, on the West Coast. When the Portuguese round the Cape, there are Europeans suddenly on the west coast of the Indian subcontinent. Before you know it, there are Dutch in places like Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula. China is suddenly accessible to the European mind. And Hazard's book shows that in some ways this was the opposite of a confident reaction. It was more like a meltdown. All of the received wisdom about the possibilities, the alternatives, the freedoms that are or are not available to us as human beings are thrown into question in the most dramatic way. And of course, these are exactly the kind of topics that people would have been discussing in salons, in coffee houses.
So this encounter with other societies that are living in different social forms, different social hierarchies, causes European philosophers to reflect, maybe for the first time, about the ingrained hierarchies in their own society. One of the things that I've heard you talk about in the past is this practice of writing fictitious, I believe, dialogues of European philosophers conversing with natives. Can we maybe, for people who are not familiar with that work, summarize some of what that is and then kind of reflect on the impact of these indigenous thinkers onto the later writings of the Enlightenment philosophers?
Yeah. So if we start with the later writings that you're referring to, so chronologically we're in the let's say the second half of the 18th century. Writers like Voltaire, Diderot, it becomes extremely fashionable to craft these dialogues with purely imaginary, what they would have referred to as a savage. An imaginary, exotic character, and they would pick and choose. Sometimes it might be somebody from China, it might be a Tahitian, a Peruvian princess, an Inca princess. but it was always the exotic figure of somebody who culturally was a total outsider, peering in on the oddities, the peculiarities of French or other European civilizations.
Right.
And scolding and berating them for the obsession with material wealth, deference to rank and hierarchy, and the endemic poverty and inequality that existed in Europe at that time. And as you can imagine, there's a huge scholarly literature on this, in which it is nearly always assumed that that is all there was to it. But if you trace the origins of the genre, the first real blockbuster, bestseller book of this kind was different. It was written by a minor French aristocrat who went around calling himself the Baron La Hontan.
Went around calling himself?
Yes.
Isn't that title usually conferred upon you by someone else?
Yeah, but the full title is extremely long.
Okay.
It's a bit like that German anthropologist who had the very unfortunate surname von Führer Heimendorf, who was a great anthropologist of South Asia.
That would be a rough one.
And after the Second World War, he took a job at SOAS in London. And I've often tried to sort of mentally conjure up what it must have been like in 1950s London to go into the post office and they'd say, could you spell that for me, please?
Yeah.
Say, von Führer Heimendorf, you know. Anyway, whatever he called himself, he was different because he was not simply conjuring savages out of his brain. This was a person who, as a relatively young man, had gone out to the French colonies in what they then called New France, not a million miles from where we're sitting, but north of the Great Lakes, mostly parts of what's now Canada and I guess upstate New York. And he had about 10 years worth of adventures, as he later wrote about them there, discovering lost landscapes and rivers. He became fluent in at least 2 indigenous languages. So these would have been people speaking Iroquoian and Algonquian languages. And he was a troublemaker and constantly having difficulties with the French authorities, and particularly with the Jesuits, who he doesn't seem to have got along with at all. But he does seem to have struck up a rapport with a number of important indigenous people who were involved at the time in these very tumultuous and complicated struggles going on between the French, the English, the Dutch, and various indigenous nations over the fur trade and so on. La Hontan ends up being part of a what you might describe as an Enlightenment salon before the Enlightenment. I mean, we assume that these kind of conversations about the proper way for human societies to function, about human freedoms, about marriage, divorce, and many other topics of concern really took off in Europe first. But actually, what La Hontan appears to have witnessed in what's now the area of Montreal was something very similar that was going on at the time, and which is described not just by him, but by a number of other independent sources, which was a kind of war of words between the then French governor of that region, who was a man called Frontenac, who clearly fancied himself as something of a debater, and a Wendat statesman called Candiaronc, who is described again in numerous independent sources as, first of all, a famous warrior and diplomat, but also an intellect, a really formidable intellect. People were multilingual at that time. And this was somebody who had been to France. I discovered a letter after the book I wrote with David Graeber, which describes some of these encounters. I discovered a letter which I wish I'd found before we finished writing it, because it's actually debated whether Kandiaronk went to Europe and where he got his picture of European societies from. Was it just the colonies, or did he really see Paris, for example? And it's well known that La Hontan, so I should say, first of all, that the book is called Curious Dialogues with a Savage. Curious Dialogues with a Savage of Good Sense who has traveled. And in this book, which La Hontan writes after he goes back to Europe, again, he's fallen out of favor. He finds himself in Amsterdam, I think, working as a sort of part-time spy and other dishonorable things. And then he publishes these books which become hugely successful, describing his time in the Americas. And in one of them, he stages a battle of wits, which features two characters. One is him, and his role is to lose all the arguments. And the other one is a character called Adario. Adario is generally recognized, even by skeptics, to be based on Kandiaronk. And in the dialogues, what happens is La Hontan sort of plays devil's advocate and tries to defend all of the sort of received political habits and attitudes, including religious convictions of French society at the time. And this other character, Adario / Kandiaronk, basically rips him to shreds throughout the whole thing and points out in this very sort of witty, intelligent way, all the crazy sort of logical inconsistencies and absurdities and sheer cruelty of a society of the kind that he is witnessing with the French. So he's also very critical of the way French people converse with each other. They're always sort of cutting each other off and being rude to each other. And he says, you're the same with material things. Like, could you imagine me not sharing? If I have food, I will share it with somebody. I come to your towns and I see people in the street. You let people fall between the cracks. I just found this sort of absolutely scandalous. How can you have a society that allows this to happen? And there are also some very witty and sort of funny parts. He points out that the various Christian sects who he's encountered are always arguing with each other. They're always divided over theological matters and so on. He says, well, if what you say is true, and there is just one God who sent his son down to earth, and he is so mighty and so omnipotent, how come we never heard of him? why did you guys have to come over and explain all this to us? And why are you always arguing about it and divided among yourself? So it's this sort of funny, witty, rational takedown of European civilization. And it becomes hugely popular. It's translated into multiple European languages. There are stage plays based on it that run for years and years. And La Hontan suddenly becomes a celebrity, and he actually ends up in Hanover at court, and he befriends the great polymath Leibniz. And there is, in fact, a letter, which I discovered, I don't recall the precise year, but it's a private letter, so this is not Leibniz trying to fool anyone or anything. It's a private letter to a mate of his called Bierling, where he just throws into the letter, he says, oh, and by the way, this book everyone's reading, this Adario character, he's real. He came to Europe and he thought his society was better than ours, which is a nice confirmation of something that's been widely discussed. most of what I've been saying has been pointed out before. This is not something that David Graeber discovered or that I discovered. It's one of those topics because, of course, it carries deep implications.
Yes.
It implies that what we Europeans consider to be the fluorescence of our most important values and philosophical achievements are not our own. The Western civilization, is in fact a composite, an outcome of encounters, mixtures, on a much more level playing field than we're used to hearing about. Because I think any of us who are educated in a broadly sort of Anglo-American European tradition, we get this sense of the Western tradition as this kind of impregnable, hermetically sealed thing that couldn't possibly, what could somebody like Leibniz or Rousseau possibly have learned from a non-literate Native American person at that time, or an Amazonian chief, or whatever, or a Malay sultan. And as a result, the way these things are studied tends to get reduced to what was written. It's studied by experts in French literature, it's studied by experts in European history, who never really feel the need to familiarize themselves with what a Malay person or a Wendat person might actually have been thinking at the time, or where those views might have originated. And this is despite the fact, so I should say, linking back to what we were talking about earlier, the content of La Hontan's exchanges with Kandiaronk passes on into that much larger genre of Enlightenment literature. So if you look at the writings of the Madame Graffigny, who also wrote an incredibly popular book, but this time it is in fact an Inca princess called Zelia, who is kidnapped and brought back to Europe, and she gives her critique of European civilization. If you look at the content of the critiques, that's where you see the continuity back to something which is partly imaginary, but is partly rooted in the reality, the shock of the European encounter with the societies of the eastern woodlands, the eastern coastlands of North America. So in a way, Kandiaronk's voice carries through this body of literature. But all of this was written out of the European Enlightenment. People have tried to bring it back in over the centuries. And at least since the, I'd say the early 20th century, perhaps the late 19th century, the standard response has been to say, well, you're romanticizing, you're conjuring tropes of the noble savage. And this is often linked to the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, although actually Rousseau didn't really have a noble savage in that sense at all. Actually, it's a kind of rhetorical strategy, which is very, very effective as a way of basically making fun of anybody who has the temerity to suggest that people of non-European origin could actually have had intellectual or technical achievements that were in any way more progressive than what was happening in Europe itself. It's a way of shutting down that conversation. And there's a book by a scholar called Ter Ellingson, called The Myth of the Noble Savage, where he actually chases the origin of that trope. It really comes onto American campuses through the writings of Gabriel Chinard in the 1930s, I believe, where he writes about America and the dream of the exotic. This idea that all such literature, all such writings are basically mental projections of fantasies or concepts that are dreamed up purely in the heads of European thinkers, projected onto non-European peoples who effectively play the role of sock puppets. It's a kind of ventriloquization.
Yeah.
And the argument is always that Europeans would have done this because they were terrified of the repercussions if they said these things themselves. So they put their critiques of their own society into the mouth of an imaginary person. I've never understood the logic of that argument because it's still them writing the book, but whatever.
There was political prosecution at the time, potentially,
Correct.
if you criticized the church.
Yeah. But apparently if you put it into the mouth of some fictional character that you've made up, you were off the hook.
You're still hitting the print button somehow.
Yeah.
A few places I want to take this. I want to build up to a conversation about these dialogues at the end, but I think we need to lay a bit of a foundation because not everyone will have the same background coming to this conversation. You mentioned Rousseau before. Much of your work in the last few years, you've spoken a lot about the origins of inequality. Maybe for people who are not familiar, define some of that kind of early mythology, as you might call it, of what is the kind of Rousseauian story about these origins of inequality.
So the kind of literature we've been discussing would have been extremely familiar to someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who moved in the same circles as many of the other people I've been talking about. And Rousseau in 1753 takes part in an essay competition, actually. And he's already a well-known composer and a well-known philosopher and a figure in court. And 1753, he enters this competition, which is proposed by an academy in the city of Dijon. And they pose an open question, which is about whether inequality is a natural feature of human societies, and what is its origin. Rousseau writes a piece which has become surely one of the most widely debated and discussed pieces of writing ever written. In English, it's often just referred to as the Discourse on the Origins of Inequality, or the Second Discourse, because there was another one, Arts and Sciences. And he doesn't win. He comes second. Nobody has heard of the guy who came first. We did find out who it was. I've forgotten again.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
He didn't win the competition, apparently because he was over the word length. So they refused to read it.
Okay.
But then he went on to obviously conquer the whole of human history in another way, because the story that he tells in this fable, it's a parable. It was never meant to be the basis for a scientific, accurate understanding of world history, although in many ways that is what happened. Rousseau himself says at the beginning, I am going to do this as a thought experiment.
Right.
What are the roots of inequality? And he starts off in a way that will be familiar to just about everybody, because it is still what we imagine to be the beginning of human history, which is supposed to begin with this kind of imaginary set of basically egalitarian folk who don't practice agriculture, have no concept of private property, basically these happy little bands of hunter-gatherers. Actually, Rousseau doesn't even have bands. He has this completely fictitious character that he conjures up, who's not really noble at all, but is sort of happy and stupid, and also very afraid of coming close to anybody else. This is how he describes humanity in a state of nature.
Yeah.
In our sort of primordial soup. This is what we were like. Sort of slightly idiotic, unable to really anticipate the consequences of our own actions, but blissfully happy in our stupidity and our ignorance. And then something terrible happens. People invent farming. They invent agriculture. One day,
Right.
he says, imagine one day somebody comes out and draws a line and creates a fence, a boundary around a piece of earth and says, this is mine and that's yours.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And people begin cultivating wheat, keeping animals and so on. And this is the enlightenment equivalent to the biblical fall from grace. This is where everything goes wrong, changes forever.
Right.
And humanity is sent on a kind of spiraling downward journey into inequality on the one hand, but at the same time, civilization. So you get the division. You referred earlier to surplus. For the first time, people have more food than they need. They're producing their own food. So you get the elementary division of classes, and you get food producers, and then you get those who benefit from their production, but also have time to do other things like invent metalworking and calendrical systems and organized religion, literature, philosophy. Populations grow, cities emerge, but with each step forward, we slip backwards into more inequality, deeper inequality, so that actually inequality becomes the leitmotif of civilization. It becomes the necessary price that we pay for being civilized. And as I say, this was intended as a kind of thought experiment, a provocation. It was meant to make people think about the challenges, the possibilities for human liberty, and what we would have to do to reclaim some of those original freedoms. But the idea of original freedom that Rousseau gives us is so bizarre and so divorced from anything real that it becomes the basis of fantasies in the same way that we end up in left-wing thought with a completely fictitious idea of primitive communism as the original human state. But it is combining what I've been talking about, which we might describe as the indigenous critique of European civilization. Because Rousseau, like a lot of other Enlightenment thinkers, openly attributes a lot of these ideas about the possibilities of human freedoms to the Americas, to indigenous Americans. And it's always again assumed that this is a kind of rhetorical strategy. But what Rousseau does, which has this sort of catalyzing effect, is combine that indigenous critique with something else, which is a paradigm, a way of thinking about human history that is just emerging around the same time, around the 1750s. Rousseau has an associate, a physiocrat, an economist, called Anne-Robert Turgot, who is also an associate of Graffigny, who's by no means opposed to ideas of liberty and equality, but is rather skeptical about bringing these ideas directly into European society.
Why is he skeptical?
Well, there is a fascinating exchange between him and Graffigny, where he proposes to her that she should change the ending of her book, the one about the Inca princess, so that Zelia, Princess Zelia, realizes in the end that this idea of taking apart the monarchy and doing away with money is a bit risky and a bit silly, and really we need to be more sensible, because those things may be fine for primitive or simple societies, although the Inca Empire was in no way that, but they could never possibly work in a modern, sophisticated nation. And Graffigny, of course, ignores him, publishes it the way that she intended. And it's almost exactly at that time that Turgot sort of gets his intellectual revenge. And he publishes a number of essays of his own on what he calls universal history. which established for the first time some of the elementary kind of divisions of human history that we still use today. Particularly the habit of classifying all societies according to how they get food, what we now call modes of subsistence or modes of production. So he starts off with this elementary division of human societies into hunters, foragers, herders, farmers, and then you have urban commercial civilization. And it's a very profound move, because what it allows him to say, in effect, is that although these savages clearly do have forms of freedom, including women's freedoms, which are ahead. I mean, these are progressives. They want European society to stop being the way it is. They're ahead of us. But in these essays, he comes up with a paradigm, a way of saying, well, those freedoms are appropriate to their technological level. Those freedoms are possible, but they're only possible because these are simple societies, by which he means materially simple. They don't have advanced weaponry. They wear very few clothes. They live in teepees, half of which is simply not true anyway. And half of the people who he describes as hunters actually grow crops. But it's really an idea that almost by virtue of having these freedoms, these people belong in some earlier, more primitive form of human society that we have evolved beyond in material terms, in technological terms, and particularly around the issue of food production. So you get for the first time this way of thinking about the history of the human species, which pretty much everyone takes for granted now, which is the most important thing is how do they get their food? Are we talking about hunter-gatherers? Are we talking about agriculturalists? And Rousseau's essay, in many ways, is a kind of weird fusion between a sort of biblical narrative of fall from grace, an indigenous critique that celebrates these freedoms, and a story about technological progress, which really comes from Turgot, which is the story about how with each advance, we kind of get further and further away from those original freedoms. So it's a hybrid, really, of a number of different things. But it is the root of so many things. It's the root in many ways of a kind of orthodox Marxian or Engelsian view of human history. But it's also the root of stories that are now more likely to be told by conservative thinkers who say that really the most kind of intractable inequalities of the present day world are rooted. I think it was Jared Diamond who described agriculture, the origins of agriculture, as the worst mistake in human history. The fall from grace. And this has been conventional wisdom up until now, up until very, very recently. And a lot of my work and the work I was doing with the anthropologist David Graeber was trying to push back. We noticed, particularly around the time of the financial crisis, 2008, there was a real slew of literature, not by people in our fields. I'm an archaeologist, so I say he was an anthropologist, but literature written by philosophers, economists, biologists, geographers, which was quite explicitly going back to these Enlightenment fables and treating them as science, as history. So people refer to themselves as, I am a neo-Rousseauian thinker, I am a neo-Hobbesian thinker. I thought, wow, this is fascinating. Why is this stuff coming back with such force? And why are so many people who write about it turning a blind eye to everything we've actually discovered about the deep human past since about the 1950s? It was this strange sort of slipping back into what I would describe as mythical structures of thought, which have a very clear function in the present. And it's actually, I think we said at the beginning of our book, The Dawn of Everything, that there are basically three problems with these very entrenched narratives. Problem number one, they are wrong. Well, they're just factually wrong on every count. Problem number two, they're boring. We've been going around with these stories for 300 years. Problem number three, they're actually slightly dangerous, because if you are of the opinion, as I think a lot of people are, that something has to change in the present global arrangements if our species is going to progress into something beyond the 21st century. The essential message of these stories, not as they were originally told, as I say, these were originally radical ideas. They were going to shake up the world. But the way they're told today is done in such a way as to say, well, basically, real change, structural change, is unfathomable in a world of 8 billion people. Forget it. Human societies have evolved in such a way that there is no going back to anything else. There is no alternative to what we have now, and it's simply a matter of the best we can do is to sort of tinker around the edges of a system that, by the same people's admission, is getting worse all the time. I mean, they have the statistics, they have the Gini indexes and the inequality ratios that show you that this system just keeps producing this kind of outcome. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of this was obviously sparked by the Piketty book, which disabused some people of their ideas about the free market and capitalism, and that somehow things would level out by themselves. And well, no, actually, this is a brutal system that will just keep going on. So factually wrong, boring, and dangerous. And then we spent about 10 years trying to do something else and trying to mobilize a lot of the new information that's become available since the 1960s, not just to tell a different story, but to also ask some new questions about what you might call the broad sweep of human history. Mm.
I was going to do this at the end, but I think we're just already into it. So this is the topic I want to get into. To kind of briefly recap this, there's European society, there's this encounter with other societies, different ways of living, this moment of reflection. Rousseau, let's say this is the kind of preeminent philosopher that a lot of people who come from the left will it's a very rough dichotomy. You have Hobbes and you have Rousseau, whether humans are in nature naturally a war of all against all, or do they naturally get along, right? And so most of the people who would subscribe to some type of progressive left-wing worldview are Rousseauian in their interpretation. You're kind of proposing a secret third thing. You're throwing them both out. You're saying that we need to have a alternative view onto this stuff. Rousseau, at that time, gives a kind of story that is extremely reminiscent of the Garden of Eden, coming from a Christian society. For people who maybe haven't heard this before, but you'll know this history better than I do, but the Garden of Eden and eating the fruit is this kind of parable about the origins of private property, that you have invested your labor into the land, and then if you take the fruit of someone else's labor, because it takes a generation to grow the trees, that is you being cast out of the society by God, rather than the let's say original band of hunter-gatherers or whatever he has in mind. But so what you then propose is that the idea of teleology, the kind of what we would now associate with Hegel or Marx, the successive rise of socioeconomic forms, feudalism to capitalism to socialism, that the origins of those ideas of a kind of hierarchical structure of developed societies your argument is that this emerges as a conservative counter-narrative
this is really important.
to the real critiques that Indigenous people are leveling against Europeans.
Exactly. It's a backlash against what we call the Indigenous critique, which is obviously multiple different critiques.
Right.
We take it from one particular perspective. And what you say, I think, is really important, because there is obviously a kind of tragic irony to this. When you talk about Karl Marx and left-wing thought, obviously that whole framework of modes of production and the way that it was developed by Marx and Engels was a theory of freedom. It was a theory of liberation. And it finishes, it's also a story about political consciousness. And this, I think, is taken quite directly from Rousseau and Turgot. The idea that people in the very distant past didn't have political consciousness. They may have been free, but it was in some kind of sort of vaguely animalistic kind of way. They weren't conscious of their freedom. You mentioned Hegel. Hegel was of the opinion that African people could not understand freedom until they had experienced the Middle Passage. They had to go through the transatlantic slave trade in order to understand what freedom was. And that freedom was this thing that was the product of this long dialectical process by which, eventually you can end up with someone like Hegel reflecting on the meaning of history, but nothing like that could have possibly happened before, which is a really bizarre idea that becomes part and parcel of the whole Enlightenment package, is the idea that human beings consciously coming up with a design for life, with a design for their own societies, and then implementing it is something that could only happen under a sort of capitalist European society with free trade and in that particular kind of setting. And that everyone who's ever lived before that was existing, either just sort of adapting, again, in a rather animalistic way to their physical surroundings, or kind of drifting through life in a sort of haze, or maybe occasionally there might be an uprising or a rebellion. But the idea of people consciously choosing or designing the kind of societies they may want to live in and then trying to actually put that into effect was considered to be an innovation, which is really very strange way of thinking about it. If you just think about human history on a large scale, it's obviously nonsense. People have created all this stuff. But the tragic point and the ironic point is really about the left-wing version of that story, which ended, of course, with the self-awareness, the realization among the proletariat of their own exploitation and their liberation.
Right.
And that part of the story generally has dropped off. It isn't told that way anymore. What we get now is the first part of the story, the original sort of innocence, or if you're a Thomas Hobbes fan, the original sort of brutal, competitive state of nature, version of state of nature, the origins of agriculture as some kind of setting inequality in stone, the rise of private property, and civilization means inequality. The end. There is no prospect of liberation, except for that one strand of history that is supposed to begin in ancient Greece with the invention of democracy, and then kind of lies dormant mysteriously for about 2,000 years, until a group of French guys miraculously rediscover it in the Enlightenment. And that is, sort of crudely put, what you end up with.
We've got to cover a lot of material here. So this is, I guess this is kind of the problem with having these conversations, is that are you scoping 2,000 years or 200,000 years? And we're talking about these narratives that are summarizing enormous sweeps of history. But I would generally agree that arguably what has been the case since World War I, but very pronounced right now at the end of neoliberalism, is that the proletariat does not behave in the way that Marx had optimistically imagined, that you just whisper class consciousness into their ear and they're up in arms to do revolution. There are many ways in which that kind of class frustration expresses itself as reaffirming capitalism, and you see workers vote for right-wing parties, all this kind of stuff. I think what we maybe need to cover before we get back to this question of teleology is that in the broad scope of your work, you're looking at many different instances of which people have been conscripted into forms of agriculture. And we have this narrative about the kind of slow emergence of surplus and hierarchy. And a lot of people actually just drop out and leave those societies, and that they will voluntarily disband from that more hierarchical formation. Maybe to give kind of a firm background, can we just explore a few of these different historical instances where over the course of, we're talking about tens of thousands of years here, but we see the emergence of hierarchical forms of society and agriculture, and then their voluntary disbanding of that social formation. Because I think people are broadly unfamiliar that that has ever happened in the course of human history.
Yeah, I mean, you don't even have to think about agriculture even before the origins of farming, which, in terms of human history, they don't go back that far. I mean, our species is thought to have existed in roughly the psychological and biological form that we have now for something between 200 and 300,000 years. Farming was invented in various parts of the world over roughly the last 8 to 10,000 years, often much later than that. And long before that, you've already got examples of societies that do what you described, which is kind of turn hierarchy on and off. Now, the problem with the kind of traditional way of looking at things is that all of these people would be instantly classified as hunter-gatherers, because farming hasn't been invented yet, which means they must all be roughly the same sort of thing. Except that they're not. We have evidence for non-farming societies, so-called hunter-gatherer fisher societies, that kept slaves, even hereditary slaves, that had kings, that had cities. Equally, we have evidence for non-farming societies that were intensely egalitarian and rejected all notions of private possessions and insisted on sharing everything. And to classify all these people in the same way would be roughly the equivalent, as I think we say in the book, it would be like saying that a Texas oil baron and a medieval Egyptian poet are the same kind of people because they both eat a lot of wheat. It makes no sense. So hunter-gatherer, this is the magic of Turgot's scheme, is that it flattens out history in this way. So suddenly these people are not fully human. They're not really relevant anymore. Whatever political worlds they thought were creating are all kind of locked up in this mode of food production, which means they haven't really got anything to say about the present or about the course of human history after agriculture. But in fact, if you look at societies, or even societies that came into agriculture and then came out of it again, like the societies of the American Great Plains, these confederacies like the Cheyenne, the Lakota, who had agriculture and then picked up horses from the Spaniards and actually became nomadic again. These are societies that did, in fact, turn hierarchical systems on and off on a seasonal basis. I mean, this was a routine part of their annual calendar. And it's an example that was described in some detail, for example, by the anthropologist Robert Lowy. And in their case, it's very closely connected to hunting and to the great buffalo, the bison drives, which were absolutely crucial for these societies. I mean, that's when you stored up food for the winter. That's when you got hides and horn and other materials that were essential for survival. And in those times of year, the societies of the Great Plains would form into incredibly hierarchical structures.
Martial law during the buffalo season?
Yeah, I mean, you literally, it's described as a police force.
Wow.
You have buffalo police. And these little militias that were given full sovereignty. They could punish people, they could physically whip people, beat them up, incarcerate them, if they did anything to endanger the organization of the hunt and then the Sundance rituals that come afterwards. But the point was that as soon as all of that was over, these groups would disband and they would lose those coercive powers. So these are societies that moved in and out of hierarchy. And for the rest of the year, you'd have a much more egalitarian set of arrangements.
Not to bring us too far off track here, but what was the method for the allocation of the surplus that they would accumulate in that time under this Buffalo police structure? Like once they've got the stockpile, how do they decide who gets the rations during the rest of the year?
Yeah, so actually women often had very important roles in making those kinds of decisions, and also decisions about war and peace. And I just wanted to make the point about these police groups, that they would also rotate the membership between the clans. So you have clan systems, and they would take turns. So if you were dishing out hard justice one year, you're going to be on the receiving end the next year, which is a very interesting theory of policing, actually. And there are many other examples of societies in human history that have done this. And if you go back, actually before the invention of agriculture, it's very clear that this was a deeply rooted feature of human societies, to move between different systems, either seasonally, or you have examples which quite famous, sort of iconic archaeological site like Stonehenge in England on Salisbury Plain, which, you know, as we know it now, those great megalithic structures go back to around 3,300 BC.
Wow.
So 5,000 years ago or more. But what we know now is that they were just the final sort of iteration of a whole series of monuments that were constructed there, some of them in wood. So all you see now are the little shadows of the holes in the soil where these great wooden pillars would have been. Structures that could have been put up and taken down over many, many generations. And actually, it's been shown scientifically that the period when Stonehenge was constructed and the so-called bluestones, which were dragged all the way from Wales down to southern England in order to do this, happened at a time when prehistoric societies in the British Isles had experienced cereal agriculture and turned their backs on it. They actually go back to wild nuts and berries as their staple plant food. They keep herding animals, cattle, pigs, and so forth. And they have these great feasts and festivals close to Stonehenge at a site known as Durrington Walls, where I've done a little bit of archaeological work with a colleague of mine. And it's another example of people sort of taking the measure of agriculture. There's no obvious push factor. It's not that there's some sort of climate crisis that anyone's found, or, you know, massive crop failure. It really does seem to be the case that for whatever reason, people in that situation just decided that's not how they want to live anymore, and they went back to something else. And there were many examples of this in the Americas as well. When Europeans showed up in the Southwest, there were people who had gone back to living from wild resources.
What do you make of this story? I think I may have picked this up from James C. Scott. Other scholars will tell a similar kind of narrative that early human societies were forced to grow crops like wheat or rice or things that would be collected during one season in a harvest. They would be gathered in a surplus because that allowed the tax man to come around and take 20% of your wheat for the year. And then one of the ways that people found, I guess, a early form of tax evasion was to retreat into the hills and grow root vegetables.
Absolutely.
So the tax man would have to dig up all the potatoes.
Yeah. You can't count them.
So there's some truth to this story. This is an accurate.
Absolutely. It's a very well documented phenomena of kind of stealth farming, where when the tax man comes through, if you're growing root vegetables, potatoes, that sort of thing. First of all, they're much harder to quantify. They're also much harder to appropriate. So this has been a classic form of tax evasion for millennia. That's right.
And so in this example of Stonehenge, this is maybe one site within history where people voluntarily chose to stop that kind of sedentary agricultural farming.
That's correct. And I think you mentioned Jim Scott. He wrote a book called Against the Grain,
Yeah.
which talks about some of these things. And if you read his argument carefully, it doesn't say what people often think it says. You know, people often seem to think he's suggesting that the mere fact of people growing cereal crops almost mechanically gave rise to things like taxation and authoritarian governments is not at all what he's saying. And he's perfectly aware that there are many situations of cereal growing societies, including very large scale ones, much larger than Neolithic England, that didn't go in that direction. What he points out, though, and I'm sure this is the case, is that there is what he calls a kind of elective affinity between...
What do we mean by elective
What he means by
affinity?
that, I think, it's his language, not mine. What he means by that is that there is something about growing wheat which is very amenable to authoritarian systems of control. So actually what often happens, first of all, it roots people in place. So it's much harder to do surveillance on nomadic people for obvious reasons. They're mobile, they're shifting around, they may be practicing shifting, cultivation, slash and burn. Once you have people doing rice paddy farming or irrigated wheat agriculture, you get a peasantry. You get human beings whose lives are literally dependent on staying in that one place all year round. So you immediately have a capacity to control large numbers of people, which wasn't there before. Actually, what Scott talks about, and what seems to be the case in many different parts of the world, is that it actually happens the other way around. First, you get the formation, sometimes on a very small scale, of these highly predatory groups who really are out to monopolize and control as many resources as possible. And once those groups get embedded in cities, for example, they begin to impose monoculture. They begin to impose these very rigid farming regimes where, rather than having some kind of loose combination of hunting, fishing, foraging, and farming, you just grow wheat, or you just become rice cultivators. And he often cites East Asian sources where you have government directives from the Han Empire, basically rewarding retired soldiers for starting a farming estate. Because it's a colony, it's a settler colonial enterprise, you know, which allows you to push out people who have perhaps had more communalistic arrangements, who are just harder to control.
On this topic of more communalistic arrangements, maybe one of the examples we could cover is Poverty Point as a kind of counterexample to this sedentary agricultural society.
Well, Poverty Point is completely remarkable. So now we're going back to about 1600 BC, so more than 3,500 years into the past. This is an archaeological site in modern-day Louisiana. It goes against every stereotype you have of a hunt. You know, when you say hunter-gatherer or forager, I guess most people's image of what you're talking about is tiny groups of people roaming around the landscape, sort of living from the wild. Poverty Point is a site of urban proportions. Its vast earthworks are as large as the earliest cities in Eurasia, places like Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan or Uruk in southern Iraq, which everybody acknowledges to be the world's first cities, Liangzhu in China. Poverty Point is on that scale. But nobody claims, and there's not a shred of evidence to suggest, that these people grew crops. These were hunter, fisher, forager people from the point of view of subsistence, who created this extraordinary center I don't think anybody really understands what the social arrangements of Poverty Point were. But what we do know is that they were drawing in people and resources from an enormous hinterland. What's less clear is what was going out of Poverty Point. And, I think because we're so kind of used to the idea of trade as the kind of driver of human history, people tend to assume this must have been about commodities. And that's what happens in other parts of the world, including areas that I've spent a lot of my career working in. If you go walking over an ancient city in the Middle East, you're literally treading all the time on ceramics, which are the fragments of these old bits of storage vessels that were commodity containers, the things they shipped around, beer and wine and other packaged goods, grain, whatever it may be. Poverty Point has none of that. There's none of this sense of a kind of industrial center which has factory-type systems of putting out goods as a way of creating an economic hinterland. So what's it all about? And one theory, which I think is quite compelling, is when you look at the nature of the site itself, it's been shown rather astonishingly that Poverty Point and a whole range of other indigenous urban scale sites in Florida and actually all over the continent at that time are built to a certain sort of standard, a certain architectural standard, which respects certain ideas about cosmology and orientation to the cardinal points. It is a knowledge system, and an archaeologist even figured out the metric unit. He thinks they were using string to basically design these sites in miniature and then scale it up.
It kind of fans out in like a different orbit or different tracks around a central point.
Yeah, it's like a kind of navel of the world kind of thing, where this is the cosmic center. Maybe it's a pilgrimage center where people are coming, which then extends over a much wider landscape, which would imply that actually, if they are controlling anything, it may be something quite intangible. It may be knowledge. It may be access to certain songs or rituals or myths. And this is something that was still the case when Europeans did begin to pay attention to such things. They realized that actually the most treasured possessions in a lot of indigenous societies are actually forms of knowledge. They're almost like copyrights or patents. The right to stitch something on your lapel, the right to perform a certain ritual. Similarly the case with a lot of Australian Aboriginal societies, even ones that share material possessions very equally, will have very rigid and hierarchical arrangements for ritual knowledge. You have to be initiated. You can't just do that stuff, which obviously creates problems for kind of vulgar materialism, which assumes that the most precious things will always be the kind of things that we value. In other words, that material wealth can somehow always magically be turned into power. Actually, this is one of the things that you find in Kandirong and in a lot of indigenous critiques of European societies, is that they sort of marveled at the way that Europeans could turn material goods into forms of authority. Just having more stuff in itself would allow you to make people work and do your commands. Was actually quite an alien principle to many other societies. I mean, wage labor is actually not particularly common in human history. These things had to be created, and I think part of the importance of doing history is to understand and remind ourselves that all of these things were once figments of somebody's imagination. They exist in the mind before they become systemic, before they become rooted in the world. And actually, the stories that we tell about capitalism are often very weird. I mean, they're very contrary to what really happened. For example, it's often suggested that the rise of capitalism has something to do with free markets and free trade, and the release of economic activity from sort of stringent hierarchical monopolies, right? Actually, historically, we know that this was not the case. What in fact happened, for example, in the Indian Ocean, is that the Portuguese and subsequently the Dutch and the English actually went in and destroyed entire civilizations that were actually based on free trade and replaced them with very strict monopolies that were enforced. The Dutch East India Company, this was all about monopolizing the spice trade. And, this is the episode that in grand surveys of world history is called the birth of capitalism. It's nothing to do with free trade. It's to do with monopolies, which are backed up by gunships, right? So I really think that there's a case for going back and untangling the histories of these processes and trying to make sense of them. And not using this sort of vague language, which is ultimately mystifying. So capitalism, oh my God, it's so complicated. We have to break it down so that we can see that these things that seem like they are immovable, like mountains, so that we begin to see and understand again how they were actually created in the first place. And it's precisely this capacity to create things which implies the possibility of creating something different again, which I think we've lost. If there is something that our species seems to have lost sight of, it's precisely that. It's that ability to create ourselves. We've lost sight of it in the process of doing it. It's not equality. That's not what we've lost, because it's clear that that never existed in any straightforward sense. If there's one thing that I think human beings probably did take for granted for most of the history of our species, which we have now apparently lost sight of, it's precisely this ability to make our own histories.
How did it spread so rapidly and effectively? Or what makes this mode of production, capitalism, so much more transmittable than other forms in the past?
Empire. I mean, it spread through empire, and this is the history of capitalism. I don't, think that this is hugely mysterious. These are systems that were imposed by force, plantation systems, forms of slavery that didn't exist before, forms of surveillance, work regimes, which were often created first out in the colonies. The Spanish silver mines in Bolivia, the Portuguese sugar plantations, forms of labor and discipline. We all talk about line managers these days. Where do you think that idea comes from? Which are then imported back into European societies under a new regime of industrialization. But I think it's pretty well documented that many of those ways of extracting value from human beings do come from empire.
This expansion of empire, what is the origin of that? Because I think the argument goes something like that capitalism needs to grow. And so based on this dynamic market system, it has to flow to where labor and resources are the cheapest, which means expanding. And then you have a kind of bourgeois merchant class, like the owners of industry and capital, that then apply political pressure to expand the empire through military force. But are you suggesting that it works the other way around?
Yeah, it did work the other way around. If you look at an example like the Dutch East India Company, which by the later part of the 17th century had achieved an incredible monopoly over the spice trade in the Indian Ocean. They controlled all the key choke points.
Right.
The Straits of Malacca, the Straits of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb in the way into the Red Sea. How did they do that? Well, they were first of all following in the footsteps of the Portuguese, who basically burnt and blasted their way around the whole circuit of the Indian Ocean, breaking into all these pre-existing trading systems, which had actually been functioning on what some people would probably describe as a vaguely sort of proto-capitalist basis. You know, these societies with joint stock ventures, and they used money, and they had systems of weights and measures. They had law codes about trade and what should go on with cargo on a ship. These were not primitive societies by any means. What they didn't have were gunships. Now, Europeans got gunpowder from East Asia. When the Mongols invaded China, also print technology comes into Western Europe at that time. And I've been to this museum in southern China, in Fujian province, in Guangzhou, which was then the greatest maritime port in the world in the days of Marco Polo. And they have a maritime museum there where they show you the evolution of ships. And the Chinese at that time were building these huge ships. They call them junks. They're like floating hotels. Get thousands of people on these things. The only innovation that Europeans really introduced into this mercantile maritime civilization was putting cannons on the ships. Right? And then basically just sitting off the coastline and blasting the hell out of Calicut or these other places, just literally blasting Muslims into submission. So, you know, there's nothing terribly complicated about this. Its empire. What they also did was insist on fixed prices and monopolies. There was a genocide on the Banda Islands, which at the time, it's very nicely described, very painfully described in Amitav Ghosh's book, The Nutmeg's Curse. So this was the only place in the world where nutmegs and mace grew at that time. And the Dutch were frustrated in the Banda Islands. They were used to getting to port cities, finding the big chief, the sultan, the raja, and basically bullying them into submission and getting what they wanted. In the Banda Islands, they'd actually done away with all the big chiefs. They'd done away with the sultans, and they'd created a kind of democracy where actually decisions were made collectively. There's more of an oligarchy, I would say, where you had the heads of trade, the big merchant families would meet in these big collectives, and they would go through this rather arduous process of decision-making, which the Dutch had no patience for and weren't really getting anywhere. And one particular admiral took it upon himself to wipe out the entire population of the Banda Islands. They killed everybody, and then they brought chattel slaves to work on plantations. And then they actually decimated the nutmeg groves and replanted them in other places where they could control the trade. So you can call that capitalism if you want to, but you know, I don't see any great sort of magical mystery about it. It's a very brutal, extractive thing, which then creates the kind of wealth. I mean, why did this happen? It happened because the Spanish crown, the Habsburg Empire, cut off the Dutch ports. They'd always been the middlemen. When the Portuguese monopolized the spice trade, Spain and Portugal form a union, so-called Iberian Union. There's a succession crisis in Portugal, and Portugal is basically incorporated into the Habsburg Empire. And as a result of that, the Dutch, who'd always been the intermediaries between the very lucrative spice trade, which is funding their cities, it's funding the Dutch Golden Age, it's funding their wars of freedom against the Spanish Empire, that was always based on the function of these port cities, which would act as intermediaries between the Iberian Peninsula, with their access to the Indian Ocean, and the rest of Europe. After the Iberian Union, the Spanish crown cuts what was then the United Provinces of the Netherlands, of which Holland was just one of 7. It cuts them off completely from that trade. So they begin to take things into their own hands and found their own colonies and start to actually compete for access to these routes. So these things are all intertwined, and you know, one only has to wonder what would have happened if China, which until then had actually been the dominant economic power in those regions, maritime power, withdrew from the Indian Ocean about 80 years before the Portuguese arrive. There is a change of policy in China under the Ming Dynasty, which is completely against any kind of private trade, especially overseas. So when the Portuguese show up in places like southern India, there's still a memory of these great treasure fleets coming from China. The great admiral Zheng He, who's like their equivalent of Magellan or Columbus or one of these great sort of explorer-type figures. They were sailing Chinese fleets all the way to East Africa. Some people think they even got down to the Straits of Madagascar.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just a few decades before the Portuguese arrive. And then China withdraws entirely from the Indian Ocean. And it's a great illustration of the sense in which human history is sometimes a product of accidents. If they would have just hung on, 50 years, 80 years longer, Vasco da Gama and Alfonso de Albuquerque would have showed up and run headlong into a Chinese thalassocracy, a Chinese maritime empire in the Indian Ocean. What would modern history have looked like then? Would capitalism even have unfolded in the same way? What would have happened to the slave trade? Most of the silver that was being mined by indigenous and African slave labor in South America, in places like Bolivia and the Andes, was actually feeding the Chinese market, because there was a terrible shortage of silver there. So all of these things were already connected on a global scale. And it so happens that China withdrew, for reasons that are much debated by historians, at just the right time or the wrong time, depending on how you want to look at it, for Europeans to kind of fill the void.
This is going to sound a little disconnected, but I promise these will link back up. What do you then think about the work of people like Rudolf Meidner, Edward Bernstein, David Schweikart, people who propose a transitional society between capitalism and socialism? Because I think the subtext of what we're talking about here is that there is an alternative path for human society that does not have to move through these developmental phases. And one of the things that is the topic of much debate about how to socialize the economic formation kind of depends on the emergence of capitalism to then create this equitable system of ownership and redistribution. But you're proposing an alternative path. So how do you then reflect back in the work of people like these market socialists, post-capitalism, all sorts of different words to describe it?
Look, I think there's something really crucial that has to happen first, which is basically some kind of acknowledgement of the truth about what happened in the last few hundred years of human history, and some kind of actual acknowledgement of that, which results in some kind of genuine form of reparations. I'm working on a new book at the moment, which very much comes out of the work I was doing with David Graeber. And partly through going back, and I'm sorry I'm not more familiar with the other writers you mentioned, but partly through going back and doing a sort of deep dive into some of his early work, I'm increasingly convinced that there has to be a kind of process of reckoning, some form of truth and reconciliation about capitalism. And obviously many people are making this case because the idea that one could simply say, well, we know what that is, it's sort of done and dusted, let's move on and try something else, doesn't really take account of the deep structural effects of slavery and other forms of exploitation, class, which are still totally part of the fabric of our societies. So, when you talk about socialism, there's a history to that as well, which we need to look at and understand, and not confine ourselves again to the particular versions of those things that the 20th century produced, which generally didn't end well. Partly, I think, because they were built on imaginary foundations of sand, misunderstandings of human nature, misreadings of human history, deterministic teleological understandings of civilization. Take international law, for example, which is on everyone's lips and minds right now.
Yeah.
What are the roots of international law? If you read the books by legal historians, they generally trace it back either to the Spanish philosophers of the school of Salamanca, who were basically coming up with rationalizations for the Spanish Empire in the Americas, or more usually to the work of a Dutch lawyer and philosopher called Hugo Grotius, who's often credited with coming up with the foundations of the modern political order and the idea of a rules-based system of international relations is always traced back to him. Now, what was the context in which Grotius was writing? Actually, it goes directly back to what we were talking about. What happened, so the text, which is often held up as being the kind of root, the foundation of modern international law, is a short text which was published by Grotius, initially anonymously, in 1609, called Mare Liberum, which means the freedom of the seas. And it's a justification for why the Dutch should be allowed to trade in the Indian Ocean, as against the Portuguese monopoly, which was being enforced at the time. So it's always presented as an argument for free trade, which also, it was originally part of a much larger treatise, which also laid out a theory of justice and a theory of just war and peace. And what's sometimes referred to as the Grotian tradition is basically the idea that we should have a rules-based order where the decision to go to war or to make peace or to trade openly on the seas and on land is not made at the whim of some individual or some great ruler, but functions according to a set of general principles that nations subscribe to. This is essentially the basis of what theorists call an idealist notion of international relations, as opposed to a realist idea, which is the idea that basically international relations is this kind of Hobbesian dog-eat-dog, brutal space in which the strong man will always prevail, right? And the alternative, you're talking about alternatives, the alternative to that is often said to be the Grotius version, where we do things in the United Nations and the World Trade Organization and so on.
Right.
If you actually go back and look at the origins of all this, why was that document written in the first place? The Mare Liberum, what was the freedom of the seas? It was actually the legal justification for an act of piracy committed by the Dutch against a Portuguese spice ship in the Straits of Singapore. They literally blasted this ship called the Santa Catarina to smithereens, carted it back, the remnants, to Amsterdam, and sold the cargo, which was at the time worth about half the value of the stocks and shares of the Dutch East India Company. It was an enormous act of robbery on the high seas. And then they basically employ Hugo Grotius, who's this sort of genius young lawyer, to come up with a legal justification for why it was okay to do this.
Right.
And weirdly, this is the root of what we now consider to be international law. So there's clearly a story there that needs to be unpicked and understood, not just by legal historians, but I think by all of us right now who are saying, well, what happened to this idea, of a world governed by law and rules? Well, it's never really looked that way to more than half of the world.
Right,
They were perfectly
right.
conscious that this system of international law was stacked against them from the very beginning.
You brought up Hobbes before. This is a topic that's brought up frequently. There's a lot of people who are proposing return to monarchy in the last few years.
Yeah.
It's a strange situation to find ourselves in because
We still have one, just about.
a slightly different form of monarchy.
Yeah.
But yes, less of a ceremonial, more of a dictatorial.
Mm.
But I'm noticing this. I'm still very interested on this topic of the Enlightenment. So the left has abandoned its relationship to the Enlightenment in many cases. And we have seen within a generation now the right is reclaiming Hobbes, is reclaiming monarchy, brands itself as the dark Enlightenment. And we don't necessarily have many of the tools to push back against that right now. In a similar sense, the left has moved away from this more orthodox Marxist interpretation of teleology. And within a generation, the right is now proposing its own teleology, which is the emergence of network states, the private, non-contiguous state, the most pronounced form, acute form of neoliberalism. And we, again, don't have the tools to fight back against that. This is kind of my job on this podcast, is that people who are today academics, scholars on the left, are just plainly unfamiliar with this brand of the new right that has now been working for a little over a decade. I'm very familiar with these things. And one of the reasons why we're losing the argument to them is because we just haven't seen what they're actually arguing. In many cases, they're saying what we normally say, but in reverse. So this idea of Hobbes and abandoning Rousseau, what are the tools that we have in our arsenal to push back against this new advocacy for monarchy and dictatorship?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd want to ask anybody who advocated for a dictatorial monarchic system is where they see themselves within it.
Often as the king.
Right. And then what's my role? I think we have to bring things back to human beings, to actual people, and not abstractions. What exactly is envisaged? When you say monarchy, that can mean so many different things. I'm a little wary of the intellectualization of the new right, or you referred to as the final iteration of neoliberalism, or the whatever's supposed
the private state, the network
private state. Yeah.
And these again bring up topics of state formation and teleology again, that they're kind of speed running about what are the necessary socialized or public functions of raising an army, raising a police, all of these things that they are now kind of relitigating.
Yeah. I mean, at the root, I think, of a lot of what's going on, and I think this is a terrible problem for the left in general, is a lack of introspection and a lack of interest in why ordinary working people are voting for and supporting the kind of things that you're talking about.
Right.
I think there is a tendency to think that if we can somehow fathom what the inner cabal of these far-right movements that you're talking about, what do they really want? Or what is their intellectual genealogy? Is it some kind of, strange iteration of Friedrich Hayek or something? I don't think the vast majority of people in the world give a shit, frankly,
probably
about
not.
any of that.
Yeah, but some of them do, and
I'm
they
sure
will
they
design
do, and
their
I'm sure in
plans
their own
based
minds
on.
they do. But would they still be doing it if there wasn't a kind of center of gravity to all this? There's been a power grab, multiple power grabs around the world, to which a whole ragbag of people are gravitating. Whether it's the kind of tech aspect of that, or the so-called race realists, let's just call them racists. These things
Yeah.
don't necessarily have any great coherence or scheme around them. They're things that basically gravitate to a center of power. And I think there's a risk when you start, before we even know what the outcome of any of this is going to be, before you even start trying to really resist, you start trying to construct genealogies and histories of this. I think it may be very interesting at some point in the distant future to try and do that as a sort of intellectual exercise. But in terms of resistance, I think it's either beside the point or possibly even, counterproductive. I think we need to be worrying about ordinary people who are attracted to these ideas. What is it that the idea of living in a sort of caste system or a rigid class system, we're back to really classic questions.
Yeah.
Like, what was his name in the 16th century? Etienne de la Boétie. Not as famous as Rousseau, but he probably should be, because he asked the question about voluntary servitude.
Mm-hmm.
Why do people like it?
Mm-hmm.
Why do they like being slapped around? Why do they like authority? Where does that come from?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think you're going to find the answers to that in some kind of intellectual genealogy. I think you find the answers to that in the home, in the workplace, in relations that are comprehensible and accessible to people, not in the books and the theories that are written about them. I think you find them in gender relations. I think you find them in relations between the elderly and the young. And I think you find them in problems that people have with things like loneliness and friendship, and actually being able to form meaningful bonds with each other and forms of solidarity that would actually give them the freedom and the security to experiment or try other ways of organizing. And I think that is deliberate. I mean, there is a great deal around us in the world that pushes people into these situations of enormous isolation and atomization. And along with that, you have the breakdown of very, very fundamental social bonds. And you're interested in right-wing thought. And I completely agree with you that we need much more serious attention to how right-wing thought really functions in society. Actually, I think one of the most interesting thinkers on this actually started as an archaeologist. It was an Italian, again, sort of a polymath, died very, very young in the 1960s, a guy called Furio Jesi, Jesi. And he was from an interesting family background. His father was a man called Bruno Jesi. They were Italian Jewish family from a sort of rabbinical background, but Bruno Jesi, the father, became an ardent supporter of fascism and actually fought with Mussolini's cavalry in Ethiopia, and was such an efficient killing machine that he was granted the great honor of being Aryanized, so he didn't have to be Jewish anymore.
Yeah.
So poor little Furio, grows up with this legacy and ends up writing a book called Cultura di Destra, The Culture of the Right, which is partly, and very unfortunately, my Italian is virtually non-existent. Some of it is, I think, quite badly translated into English. But it is a really intriguing and fascinating analysis of right-wing thought, which actually focuses a lot on myth and on the idea of myth and what he calls the myth machine. How do you take fundamental social concepts, things like friendship or love, and turn them into their opposites so that they actually become conduits for violence and exploitation and ostracization and oppression? These, to me, are the things we need to understand, how these structures of violence and hierarchy manage to embed themselves in people's hearts so that they actually feel they're doing something good, right? That's the level at which I personally think these problems need to be understood and addressed. I can't say I'm a great fan or take any great interest in the more sort of abstract theorization around it. And I think these issues are just too urgent, actually.
To watch part 2 of this episode, you can support the show on Patreon. Can I ask you about some of the research you're doing now? This third freedom that we discussed before. What is the third freedom?
Actually, it's very appropriate to talk to you about it here in New York, because I had the idea for the book I'm writing here. I mean, it took me a long time, relatively long time after my co-author on The Dawn of Everything died in a very sudden and shocking way. And before that book was actually published. And then the book that I wrote with David Graeber basically took over my life for about 2 years. And a lot of that has been fantastic, but it's all obviously also very bittersweet, because he was really looking forward to it coming out, and we should have been having all those conversations together. And it took me a while to, I mean, if you spent 10 years working closely with a person like David Graeber, did you ever meet him?
Never had the chance to.
Right. Well, you would have enjoyed it. But you don't just move on from something like that. I mean, he had a really exceptional mind. I think was certainly the most important social thinker of my generation or adjacent generations. And when you write with somebody and you have that level of intellectual intimacy for such a long period of time, it's like you kind of sort of slightly rent out part of your brain to them, and they do the same for you. And it's a very specific kind of thing. And it took me a long time to figure out what to do next, because we put all these ideas out there. The book we wrote was just meant to be the beginning of a much larger project.
Right. A trilogy.
Yeah, he'd always insisted that we'd do that book, and then we'd have to do 3 more. So, you know, David would always say that this one is like The Hobbit, and then we have to do The Lord of the Rings. And as I pointed out to him, it doesn't work, because The Hobbit's quite a short book. And The Dawn of Everything is more like The Return of the King or The Two Towers or something. And there's no way without him that I'm going to embark on something like that. But I got a sabbatical. I got some research leave a couple of years ago from my university. And I didn't want to waste that time. And I was here in New York. I don't remember what for. And I guess I must have had David on my mind, because this is where I got to know him, really, was here in Manhattan. And I decided to do a kind of deep dive into some of his early work, which I'd read some of, by no means all of it. I mean, he was very prolific. And And his PhD at the University of Chicago and his ethnographic work was all in the central highlands of Madagascar.
Right.
And to my surprise, once I really got into it, I realized that actually a lot of his early work was about trauma and memory, which I think is not something that mostly people associate with him. And it resonated with me at many levels, and it also kind of gave me a way in to carrying this on in a way which remains in dialogue, obviously not with him, because he's gone, but with his ideas. And it also gave me a geographical point of orientation, which is Madagascar.
Mm-hmm.
And if you know anything about the history of Madagascar, it immediately gets you into a whole series of connections.
Yeah.
Coming back to language,
Mm-hmm.
The original population of Madagascar can be traced linguistically and genetically to the other side of the Indian Ocean,
Mm-hmm.
Borneo, areas like that. And weirdly enough, that whole region, basically the whole rim of the Indian Ocean is hardly touched on. It's one of many areas that are hardly touched on in the book we wrote together. I'm sure we would have come on to it. I don't think there's even any mention of Madagascar in The Dawn of Everything, because our interest took us in a totally different direction. And that kind of gave me a way in, and I've become very interested in not just the connections around the Indian Ocean, but also the way that relates to some of the things we talked about earlier, to do with the origins of our present global order, international law, international relations, very much comes out of the Northern European encounter with the Indian Ocean. So what I'm working on follows a rather similar structure to The Dawn of Everything, actually. Begins with Hugo Grotius, and the origins of international law, the freedom of the seas, and the way that our present world order comes out of those cultural and intellectual encounters. But also then how the same body of water contains materials for a completely different understanding of human freedoms. And the rest of the book explores a way of looking at history that we developed together in The Dawn of Everything, which is based around the idea that there are, in fact, certain kind of elementary forms of human freedom, which are interconnected. Elementary, not in the sense that they're primordial necessarily, but in the sense that if you take one of them away, it has effects on the other. And those are, firstly, the freedom to move away from your surroundings, relocate, and receive hospitality at your point of destination. So, for example, that would be the basis of these very extensive kind of clan systems that we were talking about in North America, or indeed in Australia. The second elementary form of freedom is the freedom to disobey commands, which is something that goes back to what we originally talked about, which was observed by many of the first Europeans, particularly the Jesuits, were incredibly frustrated that there weren't really structures of command in the Iroquoian and Algonquian societies they were encountering in the Great Lakes region. And they perceived a very clear connection between that and the very highly developed traditions and forms of oratory and discussion and debate that existed in those societies. It was frequently observed and commented on. And you can find parallels for this elsewhere, but the basic premise is that if you have chiefs who can't command and who are not automatically obeyed, the only way to really engage people in any kind of social project is through persuasion, discussion, and debate. I mean, this is a logical relationship. and the basis of what you might call a participatory form of democracy. So to move away, to disobey. And then the third freedom, the most important freedom, is precisely the freedom to imagine and create alternative forms of society, or move between different social realities. And the book will explore in a more systematic way, with a whole new range of historical and archaeological examples, the connections among these forms of freedom. And part of the fascination of that whole region, the Indian Ocean, is that it lies on the cusp of some of the largest and oldest empires in world history. But it's not part of them. I think we're very bad at conceptualizing the history of those kinds of societies. So that's roughly the scope of what I'm working on.
David Wengrow, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.